Alright, so this is going to be a quick walkthrough of edition 3 of my advanced material pack. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of some of the things that you can achieve with these materials. All of these are set up to be instant, so you can control everything in real time via the material instance. So we'll start off with this eyeball material over here. So this is a material I created that allows you to control the iris of the eye and the whites of the eye separately. And it allows you to add or remove this fake reflection in here. You can control the tint of the whites of the eyes and the tint of the iris of the eyes to to suit your needs, and it also helps in getting rid of the zombie eyes effect. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the overall gloss intensity. So there's a gloss map that actually matches the normals and the diffuse and all that, but then there's another gloss map that's an overall gloss map that you can control the tiling of, which allows you to get finer detail in the eye when you're controlling the roughness. So the overall gloss intensity, I will bump it up real quick to kind of give you an idea of what it's doing. So default is 1, that's 0.5, that's 5, that's 10, that's 20. So this is really good if you have like a zombie or a corpse or something like that you want to have a drier look for the eyes. If you adjust the tiling of it, you can get a really cool effect with it. You can also replace this gloss mask, a roughness mask, whatever you want to call it, with your own texture if you don't like the one that I've supplied you. You can also control the gloss of the iris separately. So by default, I have it set to a maximum value of 0.6 and a minimum value of 0.1. So I'll set them both to 1. So as you can see, the iris is no longer reflective, no longer glossy. Set it back to 0.1 and 0.6. So that's the default value. Now you can also do the same for the whites of the eyes. Set the maximum value to 1 and the minimum value to 1. So you can see just the iris is glossy now. So by default, I'm using a 0.5 for the maximum and a 0 for the minimum gloss on the whites of the eyes. I think it works well for this example. Another thing you can do is control the actual tint of the whites of the eyes. So you want it to be a little bit more jaundice or blue, or whatever you want to do with it. You can control that there. You can get rid of the tint completely if you like. And then for the overall diffuse color, you can also change the tint of that. And this is all done via Fresnel. So it's got an inner and an outer value. And then you can control the fade distance between the two colors as well. Another thing that you can control is the fake reflection power, the intensity of the fake reflection. By default, I have it set to 0.25. The reflection I'm talking about is, you can kind of see the pattern right in here when I move the camera around. So right now it's set to 0.25, I set it to 0, it's gone completely. I set it to 1, set it to 2. You can kind of see more exactly what's going on with that faked reflection. You can also adjust the reflection tiling to suit your needs. By default I have it set to 5, you can set it to 1, whatever value you want to use. That is 1, I'll set it back to 5, which is what I'm using, and you can also adjust the tint of the reflection separately from everything else. So you might want to use this for like a cinematic or something like that, where the room has green or red lights going off. And you can adjust the tint accordingly. You can also enable or disable ambient occlusion. And you can set, if you look at the instance itself, you can set all of these texture maps separately. So you can leave it to the default values, or you can upload your own. You can plug in your own texture maps into here. So you can see this color mask texture. The red is actually the iris of the eyeball, and the blue is the whites of the eyes. So that's what separates the two values, or the values for both. You have your detail normal texture, which just adds a little bit more grit to the eyeball, so it's not completely glossy. You have overall gloss texture, which is the one I showed you earlier. Your gloss texture, which is the one that matches up with the actual details of your diffuse and normal maps. You have your gloss texture 1, 2, and 3. These are overall gloss textures, which you don't really need to mess with, but you can. They're just for macro variation. You have your overall normal map and your reflection texture, which is the one that I just showed you. You can also set the eyeball's metallic value if you like. By default, it's set to 0, obviously, but if you want to set it to 1 for like a cyborg type character or something like that, you can do that as well, and it'll act like metal. It'll it'll be lit like metal. This material is a movie playback material, so you can import any movie file you want, and it basically acts just like a television screen or a computer monitor, and you can put, you know, as I said, any movie file you want on here. Right now I'm just using a placeholder video file that I downloaded. As you can see, it's got this particular material is opaque. It's got screen space reflections. It's also got the fake reflection, just like the eyeball material. Now, some of the things that you can do with this one, you can control the reflection power, just like you can with the eyeball. By default, I have it set to 1. Bump it up to something like 5, so you can kind of see it in action a little better. You can also adjust the reflection tiling, just like the other one. I'll set it back to its default values. You can control the reflection tint, just like you could with the eyeball material. You can also control the roughness of the screen. So I set it to 0. See, it's completely shiny. If you look over here, you can see the reflections. Start slowly bumping it up. For this demonstration, I'm using 0.2. I think it just looks good for the screen. You can also adjust the specular, which, as I said before, is just a fine-tuning of the roughness. Now, in this material, you can also control the diffuse power and emissive power separately. So right now I have set the emissive power to 0, set the diffuse power to 0, so you'll see it's just a black screen, but it still maintains its roughness values. So you can either turn it off that way, if you'd like to turn it off, or there's also an on-off switch inside of the material instance. Now you can also adjust the diffuse power above 1 if you want to get different kinds of effects. So this is just the diffuse power being pumped up. As you can see, it gets washed out. So the best way to do this is to actually adjust the emissive power, turn it up as far as you like. I'll set it back to its default of 2. You can also control the overall tint of the video. So whatever color you like, using the built-in color wheel or inputting your own values. So that's it for the standard advanced video material. Now, this version of the video material has all the same parameters except for roughness, because it is a translucent material. You can see through it. And this one has something the other one doesn't, which is a depth control. So you actually see that the screen is being duplicated, a certain offset behind it. It gives it kind of a hologram look, and depending on your view angle, it moves accordingly. So with this material, you can adjust the actual depth of this video here. It's a negative value. So say I push it back to, let's say, -5. The default is -0.25, but as you can see, it's duplicating much farther back. You can, achieve some pretty cool effects with this. I'll set it back to its default of 0.25. You can also adjust the depth layer intensity, so the intensity of that duplicated layer behind it. So by default, I have it at 0.25. I'll set it to 1, 5, 50, just to kind of give you an idea. Set it to 0, and it's gone completely. And as with the other video material, you can control the emissive intensity. Since this is an opaque material, I'm using a value of 50. It just goes well with the whole holographic screen type look. If I set the emissive power to 0, you'll see it's just doing the black and white opacity mask, basically, which looks kind of cool on its own. But anyway, I'll set the emissive back to 50, which is the default for this demonstration. You also have an on and off switch for this to completely disable or enable it, which might be good for matinee or sequencing. You also have an opacity threshold, which allows you to adjust how much of the opacity mask is actually being used. As you can see, you can go to, if you set it to a higher value, it's pretty much, it's close to opaque except around the edges. Set it to 1 as a default value. 0 is completely, you can't see the screen at all. It's completely transparent. You can also adjust, just as with the other one, you can adjust the tint. And this video file that I'm using is pretty much just blue. So if you're using a full color video, it's going to adjust the overall tint of that video. This material is an emissive material for the text render actor. So the text render actor is an actor that allows you to type your own text with your own font, and by default, it's just a plain, material. So this one allows you to control emissive color and emissive intensity. So right now I have the intensity set to 30. I'm going to set it down to 0. As you can see, it's just the default color that you actually set up in the actor, which you can adjust via the actor itself. That has nothing to do with the material. But what the material allows you to do is add emissive to it, and then change the color of it to whatever you want. So you could use this for a blueprint menu system or anything that you can come up with, and you can use different fonts with it as well. And that's once again just based on what you have set up in the actor itself. You can also do text align left, right, and center. Vertical alignment, same thing, top, bottom, middle. And you can type in whatever you want. For example. And if you do want multiple lines, all you have to do is hold Shift and hit Enter to make your line break. Just a quick tip. It has nothing to do with the material itself, but if you're going to use this, that'll come in handy. Now this material is my advanced foliage material, and you'll see that I have 2 versions of it in this pack. This one on the left does not have tessellation. This one on the right does. So if you look at them in wireframe mode, you'll see that the mesh for the non-tessellated demonstration has pretty high tessellation by default, the mesh itself. But over here you'll see it's nothing compared to what's going on with the tessellated mesh, with the tessellated material. So I'll give you a quick walkthrough on the differences between the two. So the non-tessellated version does not have any kind of animation with it. You'll see it's just static. It's just sitting there. There's no movement whatsoever. The tessellated version has a nice little flowy sin wave going through it, which you can adjust the scale, magnitude, height, and speed of within the material instance. You'll also see that the edges of the displaced material, they kind of curl up. This is based on a height map. You can adjust the intensity of that as well. It just gives it a lot more detail and a more realistic look. And this is something I would only recommend using for maybe a cinematic or in a level that's very small and highly detailed that you don't really care about, having gameplay performance in necessarily. And this is using the new foliage shader that was added into the engine recently. So as you can see, it's got subsurface scattering, which is actually being provided by this light. It's not coming from the sunlight up there. That's why it looks doesn't look like it's coming from the sunlight. And as you can see inside of here, it's actually shadowing itself based on the subsurface scattering of the object above it. So this leaf subsurface scattering is affecting how much shadow, how dark the shadow is it's coming through. So some light is getting transmitted. That's the whole purpose of this foliage shader, I believe. Let's see if I move the light around. You can see the subsurface scattering effect in action. Now I'll show you some variables of the actual material. So I'll use this this leaf here as an example. So, as with all the materials, you can adjust everything independently. So by default, I have the ambient occlusion intensity set to 2. I'm going to set it to 0, set it to 5, set it to 10, set it to 20. Just give you an idea of what you can get away with, with the different values. So 2 is what I have it set to default. I think it works well for this example, which is supposed to look kind of like a wet jungle leaf. You can also adjust the inner color and outer color separately. So if you want red for some reason, or green, a more intense green, if you're going for like an alien type leaf, you can use it for that. There's also an outer color, which is set separately, and these are all, using the Fresnel node to allow you to do an inner and outer color. You can also adjust the fade in between the two colors using the Fresnel exponent, which is also exposed in the instance. And if you look over here on the leaf, you'll see the specular highlights from the roughness. You can adjust the roughness individually. So I'll set it to 0, which is completely shiny. Set it to 1, completely rough. 0.35 is the default value that I'm using for this demo. I'll just gradually scrub between the values. Give you an idea what's going on. Set it back to the default. Now you can also control the specular, which, as I said before, is a fine tune of the roughness. By default, it's 0.5. For the demo, I'm using 0.05. You can set it to 0, it turns it off completely. So 0.05 is what I'm using for the demo. It just works well for this. Now you also have your subsurface color, which is also tied to Fresnel. And you have an outer value for that as well, since it is Fresnel. It's basically your subsurface rim color. And once again, you can control the intensity of that. So you can turn it off completely. It goes white. 0.5, it's very subtle. 1 is a default value. I set it to a higher value like 5 or 2. It blows out the material. So 1 is a good value for this, but you can adjust it how you see fit. Fresnel exponent set to 5 by default. Set it to 0. Set it to 1, 10, and 5, which I'm using for this. The subsurface scattering spread you can also adjust. Higher values make it a lot more sharp and unrealistic. 0 is a complete spread. By default, I'm using 0.1, which works well for this demonstration. You can also enable or disable tessellation via a switch in the instance. you can use your diffuse map as your subsurface scattering map if you like. Say you don't have a subsurface scattering texture that you want to use, you can just use your diffuse texture and pump up the value of it. And you can also adjust the height, minimum and maximum for the displacement. So right now I'm using a value of 25 and minus 25 for max and min. So I'm going to bump up the max height to 50, 100, 200. So as you can see, it just amplifies the effect of your height map. I'll set it back to 0.25, I'm sorry, 25. And then the minimum height value is a negative value. So it does the same thing, just in the opposite direction. Gives you more control over it. Now you can also control the resolution, basically the displacement or tessellation multiplier, which is how many displacement triangles are being rendered. So by default it's set to 1. I'll set it to 0. Now as you can see, it still has the animation going on, but it's not as smooth because it's using less triangles. So if you look at the mesh itself, and I start to slowly bump up the resolution, you can see what I'm talking about. So that's a value of 1, that's a value of 0, that's a value of 2. Take it back down to 1, which is the default value that I'm using for this demonstration. And I'll show you a quick glance at the material instance itself. So as you can see, you have your diffuse texture, your height texture, normal texture, your roughness and AO texture, where the AO is the alpha channel, and your subsurface texture, which I just kind of took the diffuse texture and oversaturated and changed the color a little bit to give it that look. It's pretty simple to set up. And then you also have your undulation controls, which are the actual animation. So if I adjust the undulation height, let's see, it's a lot more intense. Undulation scale, which is basically how large of a wave it is. So if I do 10, you'll see that it's a little more interesting. The default value I'm using is 50 for this example. You can also adjust the undulation speed, which is, obviously how quick the wind is moving, I guess you could say. So by default, I'm using a value of 0.3. So this is a refractive glass material, which you can use on any object, and it will refract based on that object shape. You don't have to use a normal map with it, and by default it doesn't have one set, but you can put one on there if you like. And if you did decide to add one, I'm just going to use one of the normal maps I created by default. You can see, it works. It still refracts as it should. Let's say you had like a lampshade or something that you wanted to refract, or a magnifying glass with a curvature to it. You could use this material for that without any kind of normal map. So I'm going to take the normal map off. As you can see, it kind of looks like this is a sphere, but it kind of looks like a magnifying glass. You could actually use it on magnifying glass shaped mesh, or using a normal map. And this is the same material applied to a donut. And the actual curved mesh behind it is also using that material. So as you can see, I go below the horizon, it starts to warp, and it's just a curved mesh like this. Now you do have controls for this, obviously. You can control the inner and outer color. So you make it a red, an orange, a green, once again, all the colors. You can adjust the Fresnel component, Fresnel exponent, because it is using Fresnel for the colors. So you have an inner and outer color, just like all the rest of my materials. You can set metallic to yes or no. It just makes it a little darker because it is a transparent material. You can adjust the refraction amount and get some really cool effects. And you may notice on the donut over here that it actually looks like it has a thickness to it because of the refraction amount. I'll set it back to its default value of 1. You can also adjust the reflection power. Now the reflection on this is a faked reflection just like the other materials. It makes like a cool effect. And you can adjust the power of it. You can adjust the tint of the reflection just like the other materials. And you can just do some really cool stuff with it. So by default, it's set to 0.001 for the reflection. You can adjust the opacity, mask, intensity. Now the opacity mask for this particular material, I have it set to the same mask I'm using for the gloss mask on the other materials. And it just kind of breaks it up, and you can also replace that texture map in the instance itself. So if you did want, like a crystal ball or something that had some texture to it, or a stained glass window or something like that, you can use that. Or if you did have like a glass lampshade that you wanted to have some light scratches on it, you can use that. Now your opacity, minimum and maximum, self-explanatory. So by default, it's set to 1. You set it to 0, you still get the refraction, but you can't really see the object, obviously. So by default, it's set to 1. Your opacity minimum just gives you more control over it. It's the minimum value of your opacity. Your opacity mask tiling, let's bump up the opacity mask again so you can see it. So you can actually control the scale of your opacity mask. We'll set all that back to its default values. So this material I created for running water. So for faucets, fountains, etc. It's basically a displaced material that you would apply to a mesh in the shape of what you want. So this, this is obviously a mesh that has the displaced material on it. Now the cool thing about this material allows you'll notice here that there's no displacement going on. The farther it goes out, the more displacement there is. You can actually use vertex paint to control where the displacement does and does not show. So if you have a faucet or something like that, at the exit of the faucet, it won't be displaced, but as it comes farther out, it's going to be displaced, and you can control that with vertex paint if you want. Now this one also refracts, as you can see here, based on the normal map. And you can control all the values of this material as well. So the color, so you want to go red, orange, green, go through all the colors. And once again, you have inner and outer color control because it is hooked up to Fresnel. You have your height, minimum and maximum of the displacement. So if I set it to 0, there's no displacement. Set it to 50, to 100. 30 is the default value I'm using for this demonstration. You also have a height and minimum control. So let's say I want it to be -30. So you can make, even if your mesh is thicker, you can make the stream thinner by doing that. Set it back to 0, which is the default for the minimum. You can adjust the normal tiling. By default, I have it set to 1. You can adjust the refraction amount. You can get different effects going on. By default, it's set to 1.05. You can also adjust the reflection intensity. Once again, this is another faked reflection. So by default it's set to 1.5, but you can bump it up as high as you like. That's at 0, that's at 1, that's at 1.5. You can adjust the reflection color as well. So if you want like a nice blood water or something like that, you can use that. Tessellation multiplier is the resolution of the tessellation, how densely packed the triangles are, which you can see in wireframe. So that's 1, that's 0. Your tessellation tiling is the actual scale of the texture you're using to displace the surface. So by default I have it set to 2. Your opacity mask intensity, once again, is the how much it has an effect on the opacity. So by default for this I have it set to 1. You can set it to 0 if you like, or whatever looks good for the water that you're creating. Your opacity minimum and maximum, by default I have maximum set to 0.4, set it to 1, set it to 0, back to 0.4. Minimum value, default 0.1, I'll set it to 0.4, set it to 1, set it to 0. Back to 0.1, which is the default I'm using. And your opacity tiling, which is the actual scale of your opacity mask. By default I have it set to 3. Now my last material is a animated blob type material. Now you can see it's right now I have it applied to a donut mesh and just a sphere mesh, and it's displacing basing on the parameters that I give it. Now it also has a subsurface scattering, so you can see the light transmitting through it. So this could be useful for like a slime blob or something along those lines, whatever you want to use it on. It works on any type of mesh. It doesn't have to be any particular shape. As you can see, it has really cool effects, and you can adjust how it actually displaces based on the displacement map that you use with it. So let's go through some of the parameters of this material. So, as with all the other materials, you have your color control, inner and outer via Fresnel. That was inner, that's outer. You have your Fresnel exponent, which is the distance of blend between the two colors in your Fresnel. Your gloss minimum and maximum, by default I have it set to 0.45 and 0.4, but I'll set it to 0 and 0, make it extremely shiny. Set the maximum to 1. And the default, bump it up. Back to 0.45 and 0.4. Specular, which is the fine tuning for the roughness, once again. It's default to 0.5, set it to 0, set it to 1. Back to 0.5. Now you can also control the ripples individually. So this is the scale of the ripples. By default I have it set to 15,000. That's 5,000. That's 1,000. And you actually have two different sets of height maps controlling the ripples, so you can adjust each one individually. So the next one's set to 20,000, so I'm going to set it to 100,000. 50,000. 30,000. 1,000. 10,000. And then back to 20,000, which is the default value I'm using for this demo. So as you can see, you can get some really cool effects with it. You can also adjust your minimum and maximum height values individually for both of those height maps. So right now I have the large set to a maximum height of 50 and a minimum height of minus 30. So if I set the height to 100, 20, 50, and then the small height value, 30 and minus 30 are the defaults. Set it to 60, 0, 30. Just let you fine tune the displacement a little bit. Now the undulation height you also have control of, which is the movement of the entire object up and down. So if I set the undulation height to 0, you'll see that they don't move up and down. If I set it to 500, you'll see that they move up and down quite a large distance. So the default value I have it set to is 150. Undulation scale, set it to 1, set it to 1,000, set it to 5,000. Default value I have it set to is 2,000. The undulation speed, so you can get an idea of exactly how it works, that's set to 50. By default, I have it set to 0.5. That's 5. Back to 0.5, which is the default that I'm using. And then, as with all the others, you have complete control of the subsurface scattering color via Fresnel. So this is the color of the light as it transmits through the material. Inner and outer. Subsurface distance is the amount of spread through the material that you have with the subsurface color. Your subsurface Fresnel exponent, which is the distance between the colors, how far between them, how big of a gradient there is between them. Subsurface intensity, you can set it to 0, 1, 2, 5. 2 is the default value that I'm using. You also have switches as to whether or not you want to use a diffuse texture or a subsurface texture. And then as you can see here in the material instance, you can control the gloss texture, the height map 1 and 2, and then the normal texture, all separately. All right, so that's the walkthrough of the materials in Edition 3 of my Advanced Material Pack. If you have any questions, comments, or anything you want to see in the future, let me know in the thread.